The lights were bright too bright for a conversation that was about to unravel years of systemic silence. Ibrahim Traoré sat beneath the hot studio glare, framed not by flags or emblems of statehood, but by LED panels looping headlines that flattened his complexity into digestible curiosity. African leader goes viral, military president or humanitarian. Will Smith, comfortably seated in the host's chair, didn't smile at first. He watched Traoré like one might watch a quiet storm, fascinated, slightly wary, deeply unaware of how much damage could come from underestimating stillness. The set was designed for power camera angles focused on the host, laughter signs on cue, tension pre-cut in rehearsals. But today something was wrong. The silence between questions stretched too long. The laughter after each joke didn't rise naturally, and the audience, though coached, sat unevenly between admiration and confusion. Will leaned in. He delivered a half-joke referencing Traoré's military uniform. "You didn't get the memo about casual Fridays, huh?" Some chuckled. Ibrahim didn't. He returned the stare with the same quiet resolve that once faced down rebel insurgents and UN representatives alike. Then slowly, with no rush and no retaliation, he answered, "Some of us don't get to take days off from history." The studio fell quiet. No cue cards prepared them for that. What the audience didn't know, what the cameras would never fully capture, was the weight carried into that moment. It had begun weeks earlier when Traoré's team reluctantly accepted the invitation. They knew the risks. American media didn't frame African leaders, they curated them. His press officer had warned him, "They will try to soften you or mock you." There is no middle, but Traoré insisted. Not for ego, not for publicity, but for something unspoken. Something his silence had protected until now. Before boarding his flight, he had stood beside a wall of portraits in a forgotten wing of his office, photographs of his father, of burned schools, of speeches ignored. He traced the edges of one photo, a boy standing beside a broken chalkboard, holding a slingshot and a book. He didn't say it aloud, but he carried that boy with him onto the plane. In the days leading up to the taping, subtle warnings emerged. A producer asked if he could avoid political talk. A stylist suggested he change into a sleek suit for relatability. Someone handed him a card with possible joke responses to questions about coups and corruption. "Just in case you want to keep things light," they smiled. He pocketed the card but never opened it. The morning of the interview, his driver heard two junior staff whispering, "This is gonna be awkward if he doesn't loosen up. Will's gonna eat him alive." Traoré heard it too, but he simply nodded and stepped onto the lot like it was just another battleground. And in many ways, it was. The moment of impact didn't arrive with fireworks, it came in increments. Will opened the show with warmth, recalling his childhood visits to Africa. He mentioned safaris, communal dances, a sense of energy you don't get here. Traoré nodded respectfully. Then Will mentioned the burden of leading a nation without stable Wi-Fi. Laughter, this time louder. Still, Traoré said nothing. The next segment featured a mock quiz. "How African are you?" A bit designed by interns who thought irony could camouflage ignorance. When the segment ended, Ibrahim asked softly, "Would you run this same game with the Prime Minister of Canada?" Silence again. The crew shifted. Will blinked. "It's just humor. Man, just making things relatable." Ibrahim looked into the camera and replied, "Relatable for whom?" That was the moment something cracked, not in Traoré, but around him. The network scrambled. Social media had already begun dissecting the moment. Clips went viral before the segment finished taping. Hashtags formed, #dignity on air, #silence stronger than laughs. But what viewers didn't see was what unfolded after the recording ended. Will approached Ibrahim backstage, defensive but not malicious. "You've got to understand this is entertainment, it's not personal." Ibrahim looked him in the eye and said, "That's the problem. For you, it's never personal." Will paused, fumbled for words, then walked away. The show aired 2 nights later, slightly edited but still jarring. The public response wasn't angry, it was introspective. Something had been exposed, not Loudly but undeniably. As fallout brewed, journalists began digging. They found old footage, patterns, a respected Kenyan poet once booked for the same show, but edited down to 12 seconds. A Somali-American activist misquoted on air. An Ethiopian economist invited to speak on famine only to be asked about resilience. What had once been isolated incidents now formed a web. Studio insiders leaked memos suggesting certain guests be steered away from complex narratives. A former segment producer confessed anonymously, "We were told to keep African guests digestible. If they got too real." Cut to commercial. These stories weren't shocking to everyone, but they were new to many. And they painted a picture not of a single host misstepping, but of an institution trained to neutralize discomfort. In Burkina Faso, reactions were quieter but deeper. Citizens watched Ibrahim's segment in silence, often replaying it in community centers. They weren't surprised. They had long known that their stories were filtered through foreign lenses. But to see one of their own return the gaze and not flinch was a kind of victory. Teachers played the interview in classrooms. Journalists quoted it in op-eds. Elders nodded and said, "This is how we lead, with restraint, not retaliation." Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, the network held emergency meetings. PR specialists were deployed. Statements were drafted and redrafted. Will remained mostly silent, save for a brief tweet. "Didn't land that one the way I hoped. Still learning." It was met with mixed reactions. Some defended him. Others asked why learning always came at someone else's dignity. Then came the invitation. A public conversation, moderated, live, no edits. The network proposed it, thinking it might contain the damage. Traoré agreed. Will hesitated, but eventually he said yes. The event was set in a neutral venue, a university auditorium. No studio laughter, no stage lights. Just 2 chairs, 2 microphones, and an audience waiting not for entertainment, but for truth. The conversation began formally. The moderator introduced both men. The room held its breath. Will went first. He spoke about intent, upbringing, blind spots. He admitted the joke fell flat, but claimed it wasn't born from malice. "I was trying to connect through humor. That's how I've always done it." Ibrahim responded not with contradiction but with context. He described watching his village flattened by war while foreign journalists asked him to smile more. He spoke of dignity as a survival tool, of how silence wasn't weakness but strategy. He never raised his voice. He never blamed Will directly. But each sentence felt like a mirror. The room shifted again. Will's face hardened at first, then softened. Something inside him began to unspool. He interrupted only once to ask, "Why didn't you say something during the show?" Traoré replied, "Because truth doesn't shout, it waits." That answer unraveled something old in Will. Inheritance of always needing to be heard, even when wrong. When the conversation ended, no one clapped. They stood quietly, respectfully. The silence was its own ovation. In the days that followed, the transformation was not dramatic but steady. Will canceled 2 upcoming comedy appearances. He began reading books he once ignored. He called old colleagues he had dismissed. And though no press covered it, he made a quiet visit to Burkina Faso. No cameras. Just presence. Ibrahim Traoré, meanwhile, refused to comment on the trip. He returned to his work rebuilding schools, reshaping policy, holding town halls. But something in him had changed too. For years he had believed silence was his greatest armor. But now he understood its greater use not as defense, but as teaching. His next public address began with this line, "Sometimes the most radical thing you can do is not explain yourself." Months later, a child in Harlem wore a shirt that read, "Dignity echoes longer than applause." Beneath it, a quote. Relatable for whom? And beneath that, a name. Traoré. That was the true ending, not revenge, not reversal, but resonance. And it stayed.